Most utilities are overpaying for lift station monitoring, significantly overpaying. And the frustrating part is that they know it. They just don't know there's an alternative. This industry has been operating on the same model for 30 years, same technology, same pricing, same problems. And it's time that changed. My name is Siobhan. I'm the co-founder of AccuDose. We build modern cellular-based monitoring and control systems specifically designed for industrial and municipal remote monitoring applications with an emphasis on water and wastewater infrastructure. Over the last 4 to 5 years of building this company, I've had the opportunity to speak firsthand with an enormous number of water and wastewater operators, engineers, and distributors across the country. What I learned is that there's utilities overpaying for systems they've outgrown, communities making do with manual checks because nothing affordable has ever existed for them, and operators who are just done with the way things have always been. Through LinkedIn, I've been able to connect with thousands of operators and distributors dealing with the same frustrations, the same cost conversations, the same complexity complaints, the same feeling that this industry just isn't moving forward. What I kept hearing over and over again in these conversations that there is a massive gap in this market. A gap that established manufacturers have left completely untouched. And I figured rather than talk about it one conversation at a time, one post at a time, why not bring it out into the open? So that's what this is. I call this the Field Report, a mini podcast series built around the monitoring and control sector of water and wastewater, where we pull back the curtain on what's actually happening in this industry, what modern technology looks like, and what's possible when you stop accepting 30-year-old assumptions as the cost of doing business. So in this episode, we're going to cover the real cost of legacy monitoring, who it's failing and why, and what a fundamentally different approach actually looks like. So let's get into it. Let's take a step back and take an honest look at the monitoring sector in water and wastewater. Because when you really examine it, what you find is a remarkably small number of manufacturers, and they're essentially offering two things: traditional SCADA or standalone cellular monitoring systems. Now, SCADA was built to monitor broadly across infrastructure, and in the right application, it still has a place. Large treatment plants, facilities managing hundreds of I/O points, complex operations where that level of depth and integration makes sense. In those environments, SCADA still earns its cost. But for remote monitoring application assets like lift stations that can be spread across miles managing only a handful of I/O points is where SCADA is becoming obsolete in the modern world. It's the wrong tool for the job. You're deploying an enormous amount of infrastructure, complexity, and cost for an asset that simply does not need it. And yet for decades, it's been one of the only options on the table. Then you have the standalone cellular monitoring systems, which on paper are the right category. Purpose-built for remote assets, simpler than SCADA, more accessible. But when you look at what's actually available in this space today, something interesting stands out. A handful of manufacturers, similar I/O counts, similar feature sets, and most tellingly, similar pricing across the board. Now, that's not necessarily the result of anything deliberate. That's just what happens in a market that hasn't had real disruptive pressure in 30 years. When the same small group of players serve the same customer base with essentially the same product for 3 decades, prices don't come down. Innovation doesn't happen. The menu doesn't change. And here's what makes that particularly frustrating. The tools existed to do this differently. Cellular networks got better, cloud infrastructure became more accessible, but nobody in this space chose to use those tools to build something fundamentally new. The same manufacturers kept shipping essentially the same product at essentially the same price. Nobody asked what remote monitoring could look like if you built for the world we live in today, not for the world of 20 years ago. That's not competition. That's a market waiting to be disrupted. And that's exactly the gap that exists today. SCADA, too expensive for most municipalities to justify for a remote asset like a lift station. Standalone cellular systems better in theory, but priced in a way that puts continuous monitoring out of reach for a huge portion of utilities that need it the most. Cost is the single biggest reason communities across the country are either overpaying for technology that doesn't fit their application or going without monitoring altogether. And cost is really just where the problem starts. High installation fees, ongoing operating costs, complicated interfaces that operators avoid using, third-party software integrations that add another layer of expense and dependency. Upgrade costs every time the vendor decides it's time for a new version. It adds up fast. So let's start with market highlight one. This is the municipality that has been effectively told by this industry through pricing, if nothing else, that continuous monitoring isn't for them. These are small to mid-sized communities, towns of a few thousand people, county systems, rural utilities where one or two operators are responsible for an entire collection system that could have multiple lift stations spread across miles. And because nothing affordable exists, manual checks become the monitoring strategy. A truck drives out, someone looks at a float, they check a panel, they drive back, and if a pump goes down or a wet well starts rising between visits, they find out the hard way. And in this industry, finding out the hard way means overflows. It means environmental violations. It means EPA fines on a budget that was already stretched thin. Now, I want to share something that a customer of ours, Chris Milton, a wastewater maintenance supervisor, said when he came to us. And I think it captures this better than I ever could. He told us that their existing SCADA system had served them well, but it was no longer cost effective for their smaller sites and no longer suitable for where they wanted to go in the future. What they needed was real-time information, historical trending, something inexpensive that didn't require costly software packages that would allow their operators to react quickly to alarms and other exceptional conditions without putting excessive strain on an already tight budget. This means low cost of installation, low cost of operation, and low cost of maintenance. That's not a unique situation. That's the reality for a significant portion of utilities across this country. The technology to serve them exists. Real-time visibility into pump status, wet well levels, power events, critical alarms. None of that requires expensive infrastructure anymore. The barrier isn't technical. It never was. It was the business models around legacy monitoring systems were never designed with a community like Chris's in mind. That's exactly the gap AccuDose was built to fill. Market Highlight 2 is a different kind of utility, and this one might surprise you. These aren't small communities without systems. These are utilities of all sizes, some of them with significant operations. They have a monitoring solution in place, it works, but they are done with what it costs to run it. Here's a real example. A city recently reached out to one of our distributors and described their situation. 65 monitor sites running on a legacy cellular monitoring platform. Their cellular fees alone, just the data cost to keep those sites connected, $25,000 a year. That's before hardware costs, just the cellular bill. When our distributor showed them what AccuDose would cost, which was 70% less, their reaction wasn't surprise. It was frustration. Frustration that this option hadn't existed sooner. And that conversation tells you everything about where this market is heading. And this is not an isolated case. This is a pattern we are seeing accelerate. Utilities that locked into legacy platforms 5, 7, 10 years ago are hitting renewal cycles and finally doing the math. And the math is not flattering for incumbents. This segment of the market is growing fast, and it represents something significant, not just for AccuDose, but for the industry as a whole. Because when utilities of this size start walking away from legacy platforms over cost, it sends a message that 30 years of stagnant pricing has finally met its moment. So what should modern lift station monitoring actually look like? What's the standard that every utility, regardless of size or budget, should be able to expect? It starts with affordable hardware that a utility can actually acquire without it becoming a financial event. Then, most importantly, it's the cellular fees. This is where legacy systems bleed utilities dry year after year. Modern monitoring should not require expensive data plans. The cost to keep a site connected and reporting in real time should be a fraction of what utilities are paying today. And beyond the hardware and the cellular costs, it should be true plug-and-play installation. There is no reason a simple RTU should take a week, months, or even years to install. There should be no programming like a traditional PLC, and real-time data should be included, not an upsell. And when the platform improves, upgrades should come at no additional cost. Not a new licensing tier, not a new hardware generation you're forced to buy, no surprise fees for features that should have been there from the start. That's the standard we set out when we built AccuDose. And because of our proprietary data protocol, which is how our core system communicates, also essentially our secret sauce, we've been able to deliver something that the market hasn't seen before. AccuDose comes in at 90% less than SCADA and 60 to 70% less than every other standalone monitoring control system on the market. It's plug-and-play installation, an intuitive dashboard built for operators, not engineers, no cost for upgrades, no extra charges for real-time data, and we can report in real time on any analog input down to 0.01% real time. So operators have the precision they need to catch problems before they become failures. That's not an incremental improvement on what exists. That's a fundamentally different approach to what this type of technology should cost and how it should work. Whether you're a utility that's never been able to afford real time remote monitoring or one that's been paying too much for too long, the situation is the same at its core. The technology available hasn't been designed with your cost reality in mind, and that gap has real consequences for infrastructure, for environmental compliance, and for the operators. That's a problem AccuDose was built to solve, not just design better monitoring systems, but offer real-time remote monitoring that's actually accessible at a price point that works for municipalities of all sizes, with reoccurring cellular fees that doesn't make a utility director flinch every year. In the next episode, we're going to dive into the history of AccuDose and walk through our entire product line, what we built, how it works, and what sets it apart from everything else on the market. You won't want to miss it. I'm Siobhan from AccuDose. Thanks for watching the Field Report, Episode 1. We'll see you in Episode 2. Whether you're a